Robert Wright, senior editor of the New Republic, writes that much power now vested in the nation-state is starting to migrate to international institutions. World government, he claims,
is probably in the cards. And what's more, it's a good idea.
Often those working for world government present themselves not as advocates, but as mere analysts of inevitable natural trends. By casting the steps toward world government in a favorable light, they prepare the public to accept what lies ahead. The World Federalist Association, or WFA, is one of the largest organizations that openly promote world government. Periodically, the WFA extends a Global Governance Award to a prominent individual pushing for the same goal. Former CBS anchorman Walter Cronkite was among the recipients of the WFA award.
Thank you very much. Today we must develop federal structures on a global level to deal with world problems. We need a system of enforceable world law, a democratic federal world government.
In a closed-circuit hookup, Hillary Clinton congratulated Cronkite.
For decades you've told us the way it is. But tonight we honor you for fighting for the way it could be.
In 1993, the WFA honored an editor for Time magazine for an essay he had written entitled The Birth of the Global Nation.
Nationhood as we know it will be obsolete. All states will recognize a single global authority.
After receiving the award, the editor, Strobe Talbot, was appointed Deputy Secretary of State in the Clinton administration. In February of 2000, the New York Times allowed the WFA a full-page ad to spread its globalist propaganda. However, those striving for world government generally keep their objective hidden from the public eye. The late Senator Alan Cranston explains why to his fellow globalists in the April 1976 issue of Transition magazine.
The more talk about world government, the less chance of achieving it, because it frightens people who would accept the concept of world law.
Globalists often cloak their ultimate goal behind less threatening labels, terms as world order, collective security, interdependence, global community, economic integration, or convergence. However, all point down the same road. Yet candid admissions do occur. Occasionally, they even expose official policy. One of the most blatant is recorded in a confidential 1961 study. Commissioned by the U.S. State Department, a world effectively controlled by the United Nations directly states the key point.
It is world government we are discussing here, inescapable.
The author, MIT professor Lincoln P. Bloomfield, also explains that the UN would have to have an unchallengeable monopoly on military power.
A world effectively controlled by the United Nations is one in which world government would come about through the establishment of supranational institutions characterized by mandatory universal membership. National disarmament is a condition for effective UN control.
The Bloomfield study is grounded in official American policy. That policy is stated openly in Freedom from War, the United States program for general and complete disarmament in a peaceful world. It was presented to the UN General Assembly by President Kennedy. The document calls for the transfer of national armaments to UN control in 3 stages. Stage 2 proposes that
the UN Peace Force shall be established and progressively strengthened.
At the dawn of the 21st century, programs to complete this stage are firmly established and well underway. The Freedom from War blueprint concludes with Stage 3,
where no state would have the military power to challenge the progressively strengthened UN Peace Force.
This policy has guided every administration since. Even so-called conservative Republican administrations have been committed to building this new world order.
We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders.
Yet the potential dangers from this massive power transfer are not being discussed in the public arena. Behind the conduct of top American officials and their media allies exist motivations that stepping back in time can help clarify. The framers of the Constitution had a profound understanding of human nature. They knew that even the best of men could not be trusted with power. So they designed a government with checks and balances to make it difficult for officials to accumulate and abuse power. The United Nations, however, embodies few of those checks and balances, and it recognizes no moral authority greater than itself. Investigative reporter for the New American Magazine and author of the United Nations Exposed, William F. Jasper.
Certainly one of the most important principles embodied in the U.S. Constitution is the recognition that individual rights come from God, and the purpose of government is to protect those rights. The United Nations recognizes no God above the UN. The United Nations therefore recognizes no impediments or restrictions on its power.
An early UN peacekeeping operation illustrates the inherent danger of entrusting the UN with power. The setting is the Belgian colony in Africa known as the Congo. In the early 60s, European nations fell under intense international pressure to give up their colonies in Africa and prepare them for independence and self-rule. To hasten this process, the UN formed a committee on decolonization. At the same time, the Soviets were working to gain control of these colonies for themselves. They sponsored so-called liberation movements and conspired to bring their frontmen to power through international pressure, bribery, and even terrorism. In 1960, Belgium yielded to the international pressure and granted independence to the Congo. The Soviets were ready to fill the vacuum. Patrice Lumumba was their man, bought and paid for with cash, arms, luxuries, and all the women, gin, and hashish he desired. With Lumumba as premier, peaceful independence lasted 1 week. Lumumba then unleashed a communist reign of terror against the populace. Men, women, and children were tortured and murdered. Amidst the terror in the Congo, the province of Katanga remained, by comparison, an island of peace, order, and stability. Under the able leadership of Moise Tshombe, Katanga declared its independence from the Central Congolese regime. "I am seceding from chaos," declared President Tshombe, a devout Christian and an ardent anti-communist. For a brief moment, the courageous people in this infant nation stood as the singular testament to the capability of the newly independent Africans. As a free people, they were capable of governing themselves with a sense of peace, order, and justice. Tshombe's misfortune, however, was to be pro-Western and pro-free enterprise. Nikita Khrushchev declared Tshombe to be a turncoat, a traitor to the interests of the Congolese people. American liberals echoed the Kremlin hue and cry. Soon after, the U.S. joined with the USSR in support of a UN resolution authorizing the world body to send troops to the Congo. The UN troops were used to assist Lumumba, the chief terrorist, in his efforts to subjugate Katanga.
UN troops advancing from all sides systematically wipe out all resistance pockets, and in the process machine guns and bazookas killing many innocent civilians running for their lives to find cover from UN fire.
Smith Hempstone, African correspondent for the Chicago Daily News, witnessed the December 1961 UN attack on the capital of Katanga.
The UN jets next turned their attention to the center of the city. Screaming in at treetop level, they blasted the post office and the radio station, severing Katanga's communications with the outside world. One came to the conclusion that the UN's action was intended to make it more difficult for correspondents to let the world know what was going on.
46 doctors of Elizabethville, Belgian, Swiss, Hungarian, Brazilian, and Spanish, fired off telegrams to the UN pleading for a ceasefire. Later, they unanimously issued a joint report indicting the UN for atrocities against innocent civilians.
Chambe takes reporters on an eyewitness tour of an Elizabethville hospital, which, although clearly identified by Red Cross markings and flags, had been bombed and shelled by the UN.
After waging 3 major offensive campaigns against the infant state, UN forces overwhelmed Katanga and forced it back under communist rule. The UN and its internationalist proponents continue to refer to the Katanga operation as a resounding success.
Peacekeeping has proved to be a very useful device, not just in the Middle East, but in Cyprus, the Congo, the subcontinent, and a score of other places. When the UN left the Congo 4 years later, it had achieved what it had been sent to do.
The United Nations operation in the Congo did not just help re-establish order and peace. More importantly, it provided all-around technical assistance to help build the infrastructure of a brand new country.
The residents of Katanga undoubtedly had a less enthusiastic view. The UN has portrayed its role in Africa as helping to liberate black Africans from their white colonial oppressors, a message that plays well to the sympathies of most Americans. Yet the fact remains, the UN served as a vital Soviet ally in ensuring that the end of European colonialism in Africa would be replaced with Soviet-style colonialism. The result was that most of the people of Africa were denied true independence. The decolonization campaign also impacted the United Nations itself. As new pro-Soviet nations were invited to join, the UN General Assembly became more anti-American. The composition of the UN Security Council was also affected by the shift to a less free world. The nationalist government of Free China was one of the founding members of the UN and a permanent member of the Security Council.
That seat is given to a free and independent Chinese government representing a free and independent Chinese people.
Following World War II, the communist rebels under Mao Zedong succeeded in capturing the mainland provinces, and the nationalist government was forced to retreat to Taiwan. For many years thereafter, the communists agitated to have Red China replace Free China in the UN. Opposition to such a move was based on the fact that the communist regime maintained its grip on the Chinese people through sheer terror. In fact, the 1975 edition of the Guinness Book of World Records reports that the greatest massacre in human history ever attributed to any nation is that of 26,300,000 Chinese during the regime of Mao Zedong between 1949 and May 1965. Admission of Communist China into the UN would have made a mockery out of the UN Charter and the UN's image as an organization dedicated to promoting human rights. Still, in 1971, the UN General Assembly voted to admit Mao Zedong's Red China into the UN and ousted nationalist Free China. Great jubilation ensued among the delegates. UN Secretary General U Thant, an admirer of Vladimir Lenin, heralded the move as a major positive accomplishment.
And will eventually lead to the strengthening and betterment of this organization.
In 1989, the world caught a glimpse of the brand of justice that the Red regime dispenses as communist troops massacred peaceful pro-freedom demonstrators in Tiananmen Square. On Beijing's Avenue of Eternal Peace, many were crushed under armored vehicles. Another genocidal nightmare of the 20th century were the killing fields of Cambodia. In 1975, the revolutionary Khmer Rouge captured the capital of Cambodia and took control of the nation. In less than 4 years, this group of Cambodian communists were responsible for the death of as much as 1/3 of Cambodia's population. UN spokesmen frankly admit that the UN did nothing to stop the genocide. However, the Khmer Rouge were supported by the major communist states, states which often engineer terrorism and support the violent overthrow of established governments, and which from the beginning have been members in good standing at the UN. After the early massacres in Cambodia, Ieng Sary, foreign minister for the Khmer Rouge, flew to a special session of the United Nations General Assembly. After his arrival, he boasted, "We have cleansed the cities." When he appeared at the United Nations, delegates enthusiastically applauded. Similar treatment is extended to other like-minded potentates. Yasser Arafat brandished a pistol in front of the UN General Assembly as he was given a standing ovation by the so-called peace organization.
To anyone who has observantly followed the United Nations over the past 50 years, it comes as no surprise that every communist, terrorist, thug, bureaucrat who comes to the United Nations is welcomed there.
In the aftermath of World War I, a powerful group of internationalists offered humanity a solution to the ravages of war: collective security through world government. The most prominent advocate of this plan was United States President Woodrow Wilson. The League of Nations, he proposed, would enforce peace by threatening to use collective force against individual aggressors. But Americans were leery of entanglements with the constantly warring European powers. They wanted no part of a world superstate. The United States Senate refused to ratify the League of Nations covenant, and without the U.S. membership, the League was doomed. In response, the League's internationalist sponsors decided to found the Council on Foreign Relations. Based in New York City, this private group's purpose would be to lay the groundwork in America for world government. While gaining control within the U.S. State Department during World War II, CFR members covertly worked towards establishing a successor to the League of Nations. The plans for the future United Nations were drafted by the Informal Agenda Group, a secret committee set up by Secretary of State Cordell Hull. The group was composed entirely of CFR members. At the UN's founding conference in San Francisco, 43 of the U.S. delegates, virtually the entire contingent, were CFR members. Acting Secretary General for the conference was CFR member Alger Hiss. Later, the American public would learn that Hiss was a Soviet agent. Few Americans, however, would learn that the United Nations was the creation of the CFR. And from World War II to the present, the CFR's influence in American government and society has grown dramatically. In 1966, the CFR's influence was confirmed in Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time. Its author, celebrated historian Professor Carroll Quigley, sympathized with the CFR's agenda. Concerning the secret network that manages the CFR, Quigley wrote,
"I know of the operations of this network because I've studied it for 20 years and was permitted for 2 years to examine its papers and secret records."
Quigley also described their ultimate goal:
to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole.
Admiral Chester Ward, former Judge Advocate General of the U.S. Navy, was for many years a CFR member. Subsequently, he became one of its chief critics. According to Ward, the CFR's goal is the submergence of U.S. sovereignty and national independence into an all-powerful, one-world government. Richard Harwood of the Washington Post also openly conceded that CFR members are the nearest thing Americans have to a ruling establishment. Harwood's 1993 column pointed to the White House.
The President is a member, so is his Secretary of State, the Deputy Secretary of State, all 5 of the Undersecretaries.
Harwood went on through a litany of CFR members in the Clinton administration. In fact, the CFR has dominated every presidential administration since World War II. The list of CFR members serving in the Bush administration is extensive. Despite their great influence, the CFR elites have yet to see a fully empowered UN. While UN activity began to compile a less than attractive track record, critical books, film showings, and radio broadcasts began to alert many Americans about the dangers of an empowered UN. As a result, faith in the UN began to diminish. A 1959 Gallup poll reported that 87% of the American people thought the UN was doing a good job. But by 1980, Gallup reported that only 31% felt the UN was doing a good job. Resistance to the globalist agenda was also felt on Capitol Hill. Between 1975 and 1982, Congress received petitions with over 11 million signatures calling for the United States to withdraw from the United Nations. But the battle had just begun. The top planners behind the globalist drive did not underestimate the resistance they would face. They were committed to build their new world order in whatever way they could, in whatever time it might take. That was the subject of The Hard Road to World Order, a frank article published by the Council on Foreign Relations. In the April 1974 issue of the CFR's Journal, veteran State Department official Richard Gardner expressed his disappointment that like-minded internationalists had failed to achieve what he termed instant world government. More importantly, he described an alternate route to the creation of an all-powerful superstate.
The House of World Order will have to be built from the bottom up rather than from the top down. It will look like a great booming, buzzing confusion. But an end run around national sovereignty, eroding it piece by piece, will accomplish much more than the old-fashioned frontal assault.
Following this approach, the House of World Order architects have adopted a variety of strategies, large and small, to achieve their goal. Yet the strength of each of their strategies rests on one key element: deception. For as British statesman Edmund Burke once said, the people never give up their liberties, but under some delusion. In order to pave the way for national governments to surrender any political power to the UN, globalists need more than just a plausible pretext such as solving a crisis. They must also create the appearance of popular support for their plans. For several decades, the UN CFR axis has been organizing non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, into a force that it calls global civil society. This NGO movement has been developed by the CFR strategist as a deniable asset, for the NGOs must appear to be spontaneous and independent of the power structure. The desired illusion is that the public is demanding change. To drive their agenda forward, the CFR leadership uses the NGO movement as one arm of a giant pincer strategy. The huge NGO network applies pressure on government from below. The other arm of the pincer, consisting of CFR elites inducing political leaders, supplies pressure from above. While NGOs clamor for world governance, political leaders can respond, according to plan, to the so-called public will. And the transfer of more power to the UN is achieved when the pincer strategy is employed with a variety of pretexts. The plan to disarm civilians has been part of the earliest plans to disarm nation-states. The motive is simple. If no nation is allowed the military power to challenge UN authority, then no private citizen or group should be able to resist that authority either. In the 1990s, the UN itself began to take a much more visible lead in this movement. In the UN presentation, Armed to the Teeth, the campaign for civilian disarmament is packaged as a response to a new threat. Suddenly, a global plague of small arms threatens world peace.
The small arms crisis is so acute that the United Nations now considers it one of the gravest challenges facing the world.
The UN demonizes the widespread availability of guns as the cause of tragedy and death and makes an extreme claim. It's not lawbreakers and terrorist movements that are the problem. It's the gun itself.
Small arms are like uninvited guests who won't leave. Once they take over a country, they are virtually impossible to get rid of. For small arms are not fussy about the company they keep. They can murder indiscriminately. Men and women, young and old, rich and poor.
This UN propaganda aims to persuade viewers that they will be better off, safer, if they allow government to take away their means to defend themselves. Of course, not mentioned in the video is the role of the UN and its revolutionary friends in fomenting much of the aggression described. The UN even goes so far as to cite the Rwandan genocide carried out with machetes as a reason to confiscate civilian guns.
800,000 men, women, and children were murdered. A United Nations Special Rapporteur saw the disaster approaching. He warned the international community that if the arms were not collected immediately, the result would be catastrophic.
In many of these instances, this horrendous slaughter could have been prevented if the civilian population had not been disarmed.
Generating pressure from below, the NGO network also plays a critical role in the push for civilian disarmament. The Armed to the Teeth video contains a classic example of the pincer strategy at work.
IANSA is a network of over 200 grassroots organizations from around the world, which coordinates the fight against the proliferation of small arms and also puts pressure on governments to act.
IANSA was not created as the result of a spontaneous outpouring from global civil society, as the United Nations would insist. It is entirely a creation of the United Nations in collaboration with tax-exempt foundations and certain socialist governments in Europe.
Revolutionary strategists have long recognized that a crisis can facilitate a major change in political arrangements. Among the useful crises, war or the threat of war has always topped their list. The threat of environmental catastrophe is still another crisis being used to persuade Americans to accept a revolution in world political arrangements. Although many Americans have serious concerns about the environment, such genuine concern does not motivate the UN CFR elites. Their object is power. They have no interest in actually solving environmental problems, as that would defeat their objective by removing the impetus for political change. More and more, Americans are being told that global problems require global solutions. Global solutions meaning UN power. History shows that giving more power to government is exactly the opposite of what those concerned about the environment should champion.
The most spectacular examples of environmental destruction are those that took place under state control in the former Soviet Union and in its colonies. And it seems to me that people who are genuinely concerned about environmental protection should understand that the last thing we would want to do if we want to protect the environment is to turn over total power to a political elite that can despoil the environment without sanction.
By contrast, the best protectors of the environment are private property owners, simply because they have a vested interest.
Thousands of years ago, Aristotle pointed out that that which is owned by everyone is equally neglected by all alike. And of course, that principle applies to the question of environmental protection. Obviously, the people who have the greatest interest in preserving the environment are property owners, people who want to develop property to increase its value and transmit it to their own children.
Convened under the pretext of saving planet Earth from environmental destruction, the 1992 UN Earth Summit was a major watershed event for the globalist agenda. The summit put governments on notice that major changes were needed in economic agendas and in our institutions of governance. The Earth Summit gathering was designed to give the illusion of planetary democracy at work. Delegates labored over details of language, while the NGOs lobbied outside for tougher measures. In fact, the principal programs to come out of Rio had already been worked out well in advance by the CFR brain trusts. In supporting the illusion of democracy at work, however, UN propaganda portrays the NGOs at Rio as an independent voice representing a cross-section of civil society.
The Viking ship Gaia sails here from Scandinavia, bringing 10,000 messages from children of many nations. Here in the Global Forum, non-governmental organizations and environmental action groups hold their own Earth Summit under the symbolic tree of life to monitor the work of the official conference.
The massive and growing NGO contingent at the United Nations has become a global rent-a-mob. And if you look at who is actually funding them, this becomes apparent. They are there to make the one-worlders who are grasping for power look more conservative by taking a more radical stance in many instances, and at the same time give the appearance that they are representing the people of the world, the voice of global civil society.
Another group found at many UN conferences are the so-called representatives of indigenous peoples. The UN gives the impression that these activists represent the genuine independent voice of their people.
At virtually all of the UN summits, for instance, you will see so-called representatives of indigenous peoples. You always see these same representatives miraculously showing up at these summits. They were going to come there to represent the people of their jungle or of their rainforest or of their mountain tribe. In virtually every case, they are there repeating the phrases that have been fashioned for them by these same NGO leaders who are promoting the UN line.
One of the major CFR-inspired programs to come out of Rio was Agenda 21, a massive environmentalist manifesto. A UN-approved summary notes,
effective execution of Agenda 21 will require a profound reorientation of all human society, unlike anything the world has ever experienced. A major shift in the priorities of both governments and individuals. There are specific actions which are intended to be undertaken by every person on Earth.
For several decades, globalists developed the idea of a permanent international criminal court with the power to try individuals. At the dawn of the 21st century, the United Nations announced specific plans to implement such a court. Proponents suggested that the demand for an ICC simply welled up in the UN General Assembly, but the Council on Foreign Relations was clearly pulling the strings.
The Council on Foreign Relations' hand was very evident in the preparatory meetings for the ICC. I was at the Los Angeles conference, and Ambassador David Sheffer, member of the Council on Foreign Relations, was the keynote speaker. The chairman of the event there was also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, as were many of the other prominent people in attendance. In addition, we see that the legal scholars like Richard Falk and others who are putting together the actual documents themselves, hammering out the wording, are also members of the Council on Foreign Relations.
In 1998, the UN convened a conference in Rome to hammer out a treaty that would establish the court. Much like the Nuremberg trials dealt with Nazi officials after World War II, proponents say the ICC will provide an impartial international venue to try tyrants and other assorted threats to world peace. In Rome, a widely read NGO publication reminded conference attendees where world justice was needed most. The primary target of condemnation by both the NGOs and the delegates was the United States.
The ICC summit turned into a huge Bash America fest. Each day, the official delegates who came to the rostrum, as well as the NGO representatives, denounced the United States, decried us for our supposed violations of human rights, of economic rights, of social injustice. Many of them explicitly stated that they wanted to use the ICC eventually to try U.S. citizens and U.S. officials for these perceived crimes.
The final day of the conference would serve as an omen. When the minimal objections of the U.S. were defeated by the rest of the delegates, the entire assembly erupted in a display of anti-American jubilation. In that brief moment, the UN delegates passed judgment. America is the principal, if not the sole, source of evil in the world. All that remained was the sentencing. The resulting 166-page Rome Statute has been submitted to individual nations for ratification. Professor Charles Rice of Notre Dame University School of Law examined the proposal for an ICC.
In our system, as a law is supposed to be a rule of reason which, in a sense, controls the state, and the state should operate under law. I mean, there's simply no reasonable expectation that that will be the case under this.
But the ICC, Rice points out, has no limits to its jurisdiction.
Claiming jurisdiction to try Americans for actions committed within the United States which fit their definition of these crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and so on. That is simply a repeal of the Declaration of Independence. I mean, this is outrageous.
The Rome Statute claims jurisdiction for the ICC to try any individual charged with genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and aggression. However, no reasonable consensus was reached at the Rome Conference concerning the definition of these crimes. Their definition will be left to the arbitrary interpretation of ICC judges. There are other ICC problems as well. Judges, prosecutors, and counsel can be drawn from authoritarian regimes that are resentful of Americans. The ICC will recognize no right to a trial by jury, and certainly no right to a speedy trial. An American citizen, whether in or out of the U.S., could be accused of violating an undefined UN law. He would then be tried and convicted by foreign prosecutors and judges, then sent to some undisclosed prison somewhere in the world.
Most important, we should sign and ratify the Treaty for a Permanent International Criminal Court.
The majority of ICC supporters in government cannot risk showing their hand so openly. Initially, the Clinton administration objected to some of the provisions of the ICC statute and refused to sign. Political leaders expressed similar reservations. While some of this resistance was genuine, much of it followed a familiar pattern. Many politicians will often conceal their support for radical proposals by putting on an initial show of opposition. Eventually, these false opponents reverse themselves at a strategic moment, claiming a compromise has been achieved, and the public is led to believe that its interests have been protected. Eventually, the Rome Treaty was signed by Clinton, shortly before he left office. Ratification by the U.S. Senate is all that is needed for Americans to become victims of an ICC. If a UN-controlled world government is achieved, Americans can expect their lives to change dramatically. For example, population controls would go into effect in America. These controls include mandatory abortion, modeled after China's UN-funded one-child policy. To eliminate surplus population, euthanasia and assisted suicide would be promoted. Private and home schooling would be outlawed, as the UN takes control over all facets of education. New global taxes would also be imposed on Americans in addition to federal and state taxes. To transform much of the United States into wild lands habitat, millions of Americans would be relocated and miles of roads would be declared off limits. The very right to own property would be restricted and eventually abolished altogether. All law enforcement officers would fall under control of a global UN police force. Local police would exist to serve and protect the state, not the citizens. And the entire American military would fall under the command of the UN as part of the world's most powerful force, UN peacekeepers. Their prime objective? To suppress any opposition to the United Nations. If plans for a UN-controlled world government continue unchallenged, Americans will soon discover that their constitutional protections will be gone, that resistance to the UN is impossible, and that the once mighty America is unable to defend herself against an emerging totalitarian order. Opportunities to reverse America's course are abundant. Our constitutional system and cultural traditions continue to protect the freedom to speak out without fear of reprisal. And a giant advantage for the defenders of freedom is simply the desire to be free. At the same time, the internationalists fear an aroused and organized American public. They work to misinform and confuse so that the public won't know where to turn for real leadership. Leadership for effective opposition to the globalist agenda. Rather than cutting at the ever-expanding branches of UN programs, wielding a sharp axe to the root of the UN tree would assure a more permanent result. In this case, the root of that tree is United States membership in the UN. U.S. withdrawal would stop the UN's subversion of our nation and ultimately cause the UN to wither and die. Serving as the axe is the House of Representatives. It has the power to kill U.S. membership in the UN simply by refusing to fund any part of the UN program. A majority of 218 votes could effectively get us out of the UN. In 1997, the first measure calling for the termination of the United States membership in the United Nations came before the House. 54 representatives voted in favor. 2 years later, 74 representatives voted to cease all funding to the UN. At present, the remainder of the House lacks the backbone to resist the influence of the internationalists. The key to changing that condition, however, is taking place in communities across America. What is well understood by the internationalists is the power of organization. It's why they've invested so much effort building it. In turn, those who cherish freedom must also organize in order to maximize their impact.
And that's what the Starter Kit is designed for.
Vice President of the John Birch Society, Tom Gow.
Congressmen are focused on job security and getting reelected. And the Founding Fathers intended it that way when they set up the House of Representatives to be responsive to the American people and their local communities. And the internationalists know that, and that's why they've invested so much time in trying to gain influence in the organs of mass communication so they can influence that public opinion. And it's very difficult for the congressmen to fight that influence, fight the heat and the emotion that's generated in the nightly news and whatnot, unless they have some means or see a voice for sanity that's reaching their constituents. And that's one of the roles of the John Birch Society, or a primary function of the John Birch Society, is to provide that voice.
Informed constituent pressure is essential in order for Congress to sever UN ties. CEO of the John Birch Society, G. Vance Smith.
We have a great campaign. We have
all kinds of tools. We have wonderful pamphlets that will really help people to understand what's going on. We have billboards, books, videos, all kinds of important things relative to this campaign, tools for this campaign. But those are not the campaign. The objective of the campaign is to change the individual, to help the individual understand how important their freedom is, and the fact that they're going to have to do something about it. The only way there's going to be change is when the American people, individually, one at a time, wake up and do something. So our campaign is to empower people under organized leadership to work together to bring about this change. With that kind of pressure that they can put on the members of the House of Representatives, upon their own congressmen, they can bring about change. But there has to be a concerted action program.
Ultimately, the outcome is determined by the inspired action of individuals across this great land.
We really need the American people, while there is still time, to stand up for freedom and to stop the plans of the United Nations, and in fact to get us, the United States, out of the United Nations.